Hi class, this is the lecture on Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Chapter 2. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I did in the introduction, but you should know this is a work in moral psychology. Jonathan Haidt is not advocating one moral view over another. He's not going to be defending a particular set of moral rules from a Christian perspective or an atheist perspective, anything like that. He's not a believer, but the question that his book addresses is scientifically, what evidence do we have to discern where human moral judgments come from? How do humans make the moral judgments that we make? So it's more of a social scientific look at morality. It's not, you should do this, you should not do that, right? So his question is, from where do our moral judgments spring? You can see the cover of the book here, at least that's the cover for many of you. It will go from moral psychology in the beginning to applying some of this to religion and politics to help explain the divided country we live in. He thinks that some of this analysis, scientific analysis, can help explain why Americans are so divided on religion, so divided on politics, and maybe some constructive solutions. Chapter 2 is making a rather large claim, and that is the dominant vein of morality in the West has been moral decision-making should be rational. I, as a human being, have a brain, I have reason, I should look at a situation and say, here are the three things I might be able to do, which is the most moral thing, the most honest thing, the most just thing, and then I make my rational choice in light of that. Jonathan Haidt argues, as do many other moral psychologists, that this just gets human nature wrong. Most of what a human being does in a day is through habit, it is immediate, intuition, judgment, emotion. Very few of our decisions do we sit down, really concentrate, and make a rational choice. It does happen. It does happen in moral choices. But more often than not, Jonathan Haidt would argue, we're simply responding. So I think about my own life. I get up. I have a routine in the morning. I don't really think much about it. I don't weigh the pros and cons of making my coffee before getting in the shower or how that works. I have a routine and I do it. I get in my car. I turn on the radio. I come to work. I've already, by the time I get to work, have had several encounters with my family. Much of that is the result of, am I tired? What's my mood? How much work do I have to do today? What's the pattern of our family and how we interact in the morning? Is our pattern to be jovial and eat breakfast together? Is it my kids sleep in and I leave to work before they get up? All of these things, right, are moral in their habits and in their patterns, how we engage each other, how we spend time together. But very little of that is like a rational, conscious choice I've made, right? I go to the cafeteria at school. I have a certain set of foods that I know that I like there, and I go straight to them. But again, what I eat, these are moral decisions, whether I'm going to eat meat or not, and all kinds of other things are moral considerations. But normally I'm on autopilot. And so Haidt says, if you want to become more like the person you desire, then you're going to have to start addressing your habits, your intuitions, your emotions, right? So we're going to flip it on its head. He talks about the rational dog, right, getting waved by the emotional tail, that we need to start giving more attention to emotion. In chapter 2, he talks about three different philosophers: Plato, Thomas Jefferson, who's more of a politician but also a philosopher, and then David Hume. They all saw reason and emotion having a particular relationship with each other. Plato believed, as many Greeks, that emotion was a flaw. To be emotional was to be irrational, and that was to be less than human. It was not moral to act on emotion. or to make any decision that way, that was thwarting wisdom and intellectual virtue. So Plato tells the story of a winged charioteer. You have two winged horses and this muscular Greek, like think of like that sculpted statue, right? Holding the winged horses in place. And he said, this is like the human soul. Part of our soul is the spirited part, courage and, appetites. The other part is our desires for food or for sexuality or other things. So you've got the spirited part and the desirous part, and they're flying all over the place. And the charioteer is reason. That's the part of the human soul that is rational, that can think through things, that looks at evidence, that's critical, that's curious. And the soul is working well when the rational part of the human being controls the horses, is in control of emotions and the spirited parts of us. That's when we'll make good choices, and that's when we'll be moral, and that's when we'll discover the truth, right? Is when reason is in control. Haidt thinks Plato's just wrong. Human nature does not operate this way. Reason exists, but it is relatively fallible. It is easy to deceive human reason. It's easy for us to think we're making logical choices when in fact we are not. We are not overly rational beings. We are predominantly instinctual, intuitional, and emotional beings. And reason is just a small element of what we are. Thomas Jefferson separated the head and the heart, reason and emotions, and that they had separate domains. It was like separate but equal. You take on your responsibilities head, you take on your responsibilities heart, but there's not a ton of overlap. Interestingly, Thomas Jefferson thought that morality fell on the emotional side. Moral sentiments is what he called them, which I find to be interesting. Haidt would argue that he thinks Jefferson's getting closer, but not quite accurate. David Hume was a philosopher in the 18th century. He argued that reason is and always will be a slave to the passions. Reason is and always will be a slave to the passions. Hume believed that reason is often used by humans to justify what we want to do, to justify what we've already done. So reason, Jonathan Haidt argues, is much more like a defense attorney than it is like a scientist pursuing truth. Reason is more like Johnny Cochran trying to get his client off than it is like a judge who's dispassionately looking at the evidence, right? Reason is like a press secretary whose job it is to spin the information to protect the president or the party rather than someone looking for the truth. So Hume argued reason is often biased. It often comes after the fact, and that the dominant thing that drives human behavior, human judgments, human morality is emotion. Haidt believes that evidence supports Hume, that there's a lot of mounting data to suggest Hume got human nature correct. And that's part of the thesis of his book, which you don't have to agree with, right? You might push back. But Jonathan Haidt believes that history has shown Hume to be correct, that humans are predominantly intuitional, instinctual, habitual, and emotional. We are only to a limited extent rational. And that most of the time reason is used to preserve our reputations. Reason is predominantly used as a defense attorney or press secretary. Someone who's done some work in this area of neuroscience is Antonio Damasio. He's referenced in Chapter 2. On Canvas, I connected a YouTube video about Antonio Damasio's work. Essentially, he works with people who have experienced brain damage, frontal lobe damage. Many of these patients, before their brain damage or before they developed brain tumors in the frontal lobe, were very normal functioning and all of that. After the damage, after the lesions, they were not quite the same. They score well on intelligence tests and IQ tests, but where they seem to be lacking is in emotional awareness. They can't read emotions of others. They have a hard time generating emotion of their own. They talk about being very flat emotionally. But it's crazy how that kind of impairment leads to real-world decision-making that is very poor. These people often have a hard time in relationships. They often have a hard time with finances. Many go bankrupt. Many end up divorced. But it's not about reason. The deficiency is emotional. And this highlights some of what Haidt is trying to talk about. If this kind of thing interests you, I highly recommend you watch that YouTube video that I posted on Canvas of Antonio Damasio's work. He wrote a famous book called Descartes' Error, which I highly recommend. So one of the things that Haidt wants to do in Chapter 2 is to make the argument that you and I and all humans are dual processing animals. System 1, process 1, is our, think of like the reptilian brain. Think about like the older part of the human brain, fight or flight, instinctual, very emotional, right? That we process information subconsciously all the time. We have lots of feelings as we enter a room, whether it's safe or not. Do I feel like I belong or not? We have so many intuitions happening all the time, we can't possibly be aware of them all in our conscious reasoning, right? So system 1 is that instinctual, instantaneous, automatic processing system. System 2, this is why it's called dual process. System 2 is that frontal lobe, very slow, effortful, mathematical reasoning, solving a problem, pro-con list, right? And both of those systems exist within the human person, right? System 1 makes instantaneous judgments, right? System 2 is slow and processes after the fact, right? Dual processing. Haidt says we can see this clearly in instances of moral dumbfounding, right? Moral dumbfounding. So he listed all kinds of experiments. I love these. They just mess with people, right? They just bring people in the lab and see what they'll do. You know, they have a clean glass of water. They have a totally sanitized cockroach that has been boiled and cleaned entirely, and they simply dip the cockroach briefly into the clean water, and then they see if the participant's willing to drink. They'll give them money if they'll take a drink, because they get big grants, right? So they'll give you $5 to do it. Most people will not do it. Why? The cockroach is totally sterilized. There's no chance you could get sick. Everything's fine. But our intuition is like, that's gross. Like, there's no way I'm going to touch that water after the cockroach has been in it. I don't care if it's clean, right? You have an intuitional judgment of dirty. You have a rational part of you that says, I probably could use the $5. And then you've got a clash. The moral dumbfounding is when System 1 clashes with System 2. I feel like I shouldn't drink that water. I don't have a good reason for not drinking it. Intuitions clash with reason. You know, they'll bring atheists into the lab, and then they'll ask them to sign their soul over to Satan, right? Yes, I hereby sign my soul over to Satan, a person they don't believe in, to a place, hell, they don't believe in. If they'll do it, they'll get $5. People won't do it. Like, no, that feels weird for me to sign my soul over. And then the researcher will say, do you believe you have a soul? Not really. Do you believe in Satan? No. Then why won't you sign the paper and take the money? It's free. I don't know, right? It doesn't feel right for me to do that. It's moral dumbfounding. A large example given in the text was about incest, a brother and a sister. I've done this in my various classes. Students immediately like, oh, that's so gross, right? Especially if you have a sibling of the opposite sex, like, oh, like, I can't imagine. Absolutely, I'm grossed out too. Why is it wrong, right? What makes it morally wrong? And they say things like, well, if they had a baby, it might be, you know, have problems genetically. Well, we already talked about them using birth control. Sometimes the example's changed where the woman is past childbearing age, and so there's no chance of pregnancy, or that she's had a hysterectomy, can't have a baby. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the feeling, right? So then students say, well, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's wrong because they're not married. Okay, well, what if they got married? Would you feel okay then? And no, not really. What you find is that students are searching for reasons to attach to their intuitional, their emotional reaction. This is gross, this is wrong, and now I have to find a reason why it's wrong, and most of the reasons they give are bad. Reason is coming after the fact as a defense attorney to justify the emotion, right? Reason is coming after the fact. Why can't two siblings that love each other, that want to be together, they're not hurting anyone, if they're married, they're in a long-term relationship, but something inside of us says it's wrong, but again, moral dumbfounding. System 1 says, ooh, that's gross, that's wrong, that's incest. System 2 has a hard time finding a coherent moral reason why it's wrong. This tells you you've got two systems in play. Haidt argues system 1 is more powerful. System 1, that emotional, that intuitional part of you, happens immediately. It happens all the time. It's going on all, right? Think about listening to AM talk radio or watching the news. Boom, immediately like, oh, I can't believe that. You have a particular political party. If someone from the other political party says something, they're lying, or what? Can you believe they would say that, right? But when your own party does it, we say, well, I mean, they don't understand how complicated it is. X, Y, and Z. We make excuses for our own. We attack the opposing side even when they do the same kind of thing. Our emotions, our intuitions want to support our team. Sports team, political team, religious team, you name it. We want to reject the opposing team intuitionally, instinctually. And then we try to find reasons why it's okay, why it's different. So this is happening all the time. I would submit it's happening all the time. I'll give some political examples to help. I remember after Donald Trump got elected, there were a lot of people that went out and said, not my president, right? There were like rallies, hashtag not my president. So many Republicans, it was on the news a lot, you know, Democrats are sore losers and it was a fair election, get behind the president. And there was a lot of like visceral reaction. Like if someone was to say, this isn't my president, like, ooh, right? Like that you're an outsider, you're a Democrat, you're a liberal, you're whining, you're complaining. And so there's like an immediate reaction against those individuals. Fall in line, stop being babies, right? What I found interesting though is 8 years earlier, when Barack Obama was elected, there were large Republican factions who wouldn't accept it because they said he wasn't a United States citizen, right? That the birth certificate he gave wasn't good enough for them. That they continued to say he was from Africa. They would not acknowledge his presidency. So the same Republicans who were accusing Democrats of being sore losers were sore losers. Both Republicans and Democrats are sore losers, right? Most humans are sore losers. But what's so irrational, but very human, is we criticize the out-group for doing exactly the same thing we do, and we justify it when we do it. Our reason allows us to justify it when we do it. We justify system 1, and it allows us to criticize our out-group, right? So this was Hume's point. Reason serves the passions and the emotions. If this is true, if we want to become more moral, more rational, more fair, more just, we have to shape our intuitions, our emotions. We have to cultivate a different kind of character that makes us more open-minded, more humble, right? Because by nature, we don't do those things. So here's the 2 types of cognition. Most of the page numbers I have here will not correspond to your page numbers. I believe you have softback, I have hardback. You can ignore that, although it'll get you close to the right place. 2 types of cognition, right? Intuition versus conscious reasoning, system 1 versus system 2. Haidt calls it the elephant and the rider, and I love this metaphor. Elephant is the big, giant animal. That represents system 1. That's your automatic processing. It's effortless, it's fast, it's automatic, it's happening all the time. Some of you have already had an elephant reaction to what I've been saying on this lecture video. You're like, yes, you really like it, or you're like, ooh, I don't think so. You're already having an elephant reaction. Be aware of that. Be thoughtful of that, right? It's happening. You don't choose to have it happen. Your elephant just responds. It's not about thinking. It's just you have reactions in the world, right? The rider is this little guy on top of the elephant, right? And that represents system 2. That's the reason, conscious, effortful, mathematical, calculating. Most of us is the elephant. Some of us is the rider, right? So there's a picture here, elephant and rider. The elephant is emotional, experiencing self, fast, automatic, responsive. It's not self-aware, right? It's happening before self-awareness and all of that. Most of it is internal. It will often lead to us saying things or acting, but it doesn't have to. The moral person, I would argue, the elephant responds and reacts to the environment, but the moral person stops, takes a breath, and then decides, am I going to listen to the elephant or am I not going to listen to the elephant, right? The rider is that small guy on top, the rational, remembering self, again, slow and effortful, conscious, and that's the part that we can't rely on too much because he's often coming to the party late. Emotion and the elephant's already responded. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is the social intuitionist model. Again, the page number is not here, but it's figure 2.4 in all of our texts. And it's got these bubbles. And so this is kind of how Jonathan Haidt sees the world and how it functions, right? So let's think about a triggering event, something that might elicit an elephant response an elephant response in the real world in something that might be relevant to morality. We okay? So some of you know about the NFL protests. They basically died away, but a few years ago, NFL players, some of them, would kneel silently during the national anthem before a game, right? They were not yelling. They did not have any signs. It was a silent, nonviolent protest. Some of you who know about this already have an elephant reaction. You already have either you think the players were totally wrong in what they did and it was disrespectful, or maybe you respect what the players did and this is a country where protest should be allowed, but your elephant is already responding just to me talking about it, right? So many Americans, when they saw football players kneeling, that's a triggering event. The elephant has a response. You're kneeling during the national anthem, right? The intuition, so look right here, this is intuition. My elephant has a response, leads to a judgment. These players shouldn't be kneeling. These players are entitled. They're getting paid millions of dollars. They have all these freedoms because of the military. They need to stand during the anthem. The intuition leads to a moral judgment, a moral condemnation, or a moral praise on the players that are doing this, right? So that's link one, from intuition to judgment. Then the reason comes after. Someone says, why does it bother you? Why are you bothered by the players kneeling? They're not hurting anyone. It's not during the game, right? And then it's like, well, it's disrespectful to the flag. Oh, okay. But the players have explained they're not upset with the United States. They're just using this platform to bring awareness to racial injustice in our country. More people of color are incarcerated every year. The percentages are way far from being equal. Something's wrong. We need to address it. So this isn't about the country. This is about racial injustice. Yeah, but they're getting paid a lot of money. Oh, but if you're getting paid a lot of money, does that mean you're not allowed to disagree with certain policies in the country? Can only poor people protest? Well, no, but the owners have every right to tell them to stand. Okay, they might have a right to tell them to stand, but they haven't done that yet. There's no policy. And so what you have is an emotional reaction, a judgment. When it's time to give a justification, there's a search for reasons to support it, but many of those reasons, in my estimation at least, seem to fail. Don't we want there to be social awareness in our country? Don't we want people, if they're going to protest, to do it non-violently, silently, right? In ways that are respectful? Didn't it get us talking about these issues as a country? So in my mind, like whether you agree or disagree with racial injustice or any of that, it seems like exactly the kind of protest we would want to support in a free country, right? The kind where no one gets hurt, no one's screaming obscenities, there's no insults going around. It's a simple taking of a knee, right? But in Haidt's mind, we have these reactions all the time. Some of you might want to, with your elephant, support the players, right? So your intuition is they're doing something noble, they're so good, why won't more players be courageous? And then if someone asks you why, once again, we search for reasons. Often we come up with reasons that close our mind to the opposing view. We're unwilling to listen now. Maybe there are good criticisms that we're not taking into account. Maybe my elephant is so biased in favor of the players that I won't listen to those who might have criticisms. And that's a problem, right? We want to be aware that we're having certain reactions, understand where they're coming from, and then try to give a fair assessment. The reason it's a social intuitionist model is that you also have B down here. So this is A, what's happening in A. This is what's happening in B. We live in communities so that my intuitions are shaped by my community, my environment, the people I care about. So A's judgment will shape B's intuition and vice versa, right? A's reasoning, like in a class, I give reasons for ethics, that might shape a student's intuition or a student's judgment. So we're kind of engaged not just in an individual process, but in a communal process. So if you go into the Deep South in 1940, many people's intuitions have been shaped in racist ways, right? Their communities are racist and their families are racist. That social network shapes the elephant. The surroundings shape your elephant, shape your natural reactions, right? If you're an American, you might have a natural elephant aversion to a Muslim. Like, ooh, are they dangerous? They're on the plane. What's going on? But if you're a Muslim, you might not have that reaction to a Muslim. You might have that reaction to an American Christian. Do they mean me harm, right? If your environment, your society, your community has a lot to do with how your elephant is shaped and formed. Later in the class, we're going to talk about forming the elephant in Christian ways so that our natural reactions are more Christian, more in line with Christ. Because our elephants by nature are not. They're kind of wild, right? So you go to the Deep South in the 1940s, people's intuitions are racist because that's their culture and their society. There's all kinds of judgments made, words used, other things that are derogatory to racial groups, right? All of this begins to shape those that are a part of that are influenced by that. And so it takes a lot of work to kind of come out of it, right? So those are links 3 and 4, how community and society shape us. I want to talk a little bit about link 5 here. Can you see it going from reasoning back to judgment? And link 6, going from reasoning back to intuition. Here's how this works. So link 5 and 6. Link 5 is when reason reshapes judgment. Again, I think this is rare according to Haidt, because mostly emotion is driving us and intuition is driving us. But reason can, over time, begin to change our judgments. The person raised in a racist environment over time can be exposed to different kinds of people, can read literature, can begin to think, racism seems blatantly wrong. Like, I would not want anyone to treat me this way because of the color of my skin. Maybe I shouldn't treat other people that way either, right? And that reason can actually slowly begin to change the person's natural judgment based on upbringing, environment, and whatnot. That's link 5. Over time, reasoning can even change your intuition. So the person who was once racist and is now coming to realize that that's an immoral worldview, the first thing that happens is their judgment changes, but their elephant still responds to people of color differently, right? Like they still have a hard time with their elephant. In their head, they know it's wrong, but they still haven't got to their core, right? This is the two systems battling each other, the moral dumbfounding. I know it's wrong to be racist, but I still have these thoughts, impulses, intuitions, and emotions, right? But over time, through more exposure, through more rational processing, through more self-reflection, that person can actually get to a point where their elephant is reshaped, their intuition here, their intuitions have been reshaped, and Now they no longer have the same problem with people of color at the elephant level, at the intuitional level. And that, again, I think is the goal, is shaping and structuring those intuitions to make them more in line with the person and the people we want to be. I hope this has been clear to you. You don't have to agree with Haidt. He's going to try to give evidence to support his view, but feel free to be critical, right? This is not fact. This is a theory. And ask questions, right? Think about the parts that are strong and that you think deserve more consideration, the parts that are weak, and hopefully we'll have good discussion on the discussion board.